Alright, so this is going to be a beginner video, so if you're not a beginner, this is not really going to be... Well, maybe it'll be helpful if you're like a returning player. So I'll try to go in depth as much as possible in regards to these questions we've got here, and there's a few more after this. So let's go with the first one here. The mitigations and buffs and breaks. So mitigation is very important. Actually, I would say breaks are the most important because those are the easiest to obtain. Mitigation is probably the second, and then buffs the third. So it goes breaks. You want to definitely have someone who has breaks on your team first, because if you don't have any breaks on your team, and the boss can be attacked or magic broken, you need to have a breaker on your team, even if it's only like 85%. If that's all you've got is an 85% breaker, then that's all you've got. So at least it'll be something. The defense and spirit breaks are only useful if you are already situated to be able to do that. Mitigation is incredibly important. There are three types of, actually technically 4 types of mitigation now. So the first is physical mitigation, so you'll be taking less damage from physical depending on how high your mitigation is. Typically it's 85%, which is good enough. Next is magical mitigation, which is the most important in the game because most damage is magical, with some variations of their, fixed damage and things like that. And then lastly, well, thirdly, we have general mitigation, which in game is just called mitigation with no physical or magical and the prefix of it. In game it's just called mitigation, but I call it general mitigation to make it more, unique. So it's the mitigation in between, which allows you to mitigate other kinds of damage in the game. So not as common compared to physical and magical mitigation, but it's there. And then the most rare, although it's come out a lot more nowadays, is racial mitigation. So against certain enemies like demon mitigation, aquatic mitigation. Those are so niche and rare that they're almost not even worth thinking about, because unless the unit specifically has it, you're not really going out of your way to get it. In the future, I'm sure they'll make more units that have these kind of things, but I can probably count on my 10 hands the amount of units that are relevant that have racial mitigation. So I would, as a new player, I wouldn't even worry about that. But I will make you aware of it. So breakers. There's a lot of breakers in the game, but some of them are bad because they're JP breakers, but some people still like to use them because they have field effects, like Vanille. Vanille's a very good example of what, surprisingly, I didn't think it would catch on, but caught on the global version. Because she has some field effects and things like that, so it's good. But typically on global, you want to be looking towards global breakers. And typically they have good breaks on them, like 90% breaks. That's what you want to have those. The higher the break is, the better result it will be. Like, for example, if you have 90% attack magic break on the enemy, you're not going to be taking a lot of damage if you have all your other stuff set up, like buffs and things like that. You won't be taking very much damage at all. That's a very high break. It's the highest in the game. There has not been anything higher than 90% as of this video. And then buffs, they're very helpful as well. If you have Sylvie, for example, you may be already aware of her Brave Shift LB, where it has 400% stat buffs, which is the highest in the game. Well, that you can obtain normally. There's 450%, but it's only in Clash of Wills, and only on certain characters. So hopefully that answers all your questions in regards to that. There isn't much else to really say about that, but we'll be talking about team organization soon. Chaining. So you only want to chain with other characters that have that equal chaining. So for example, if I have 2 units that have 27 hits on their LB or SLB, I want to go ahead and chain those together. Now if I have someone who's 24 and someone who's 27, you can still make them work technically, but you need to time them correctly. So for example, the 27 may be faster or slower than the 24, so you kind of have to maneuver, and you're not going to get the full hits. Even if I went in and did that, I wouldn't get the full hits of that because they don't time up correctly even. So one ends sooner than the other, so you're not going to be able to get all those hits, and you're going to have some lasting hits after. So you really want to do Bolting Strike and Bolting Strike in AoE and AoE, and not... You can mix them together as long as you're doing 2 and 2. So for example, if I have 2 Bolting Strike characters and I have 2 Stardust Ray characters, and I chain the bolting strike after the starter strike, or either or, they will chain together to make over 100 chain, which is what you need in Dark Visions and Clash Duels and things like that, and of that nature. So it's how you're able to chain properly. It'll get pretty simple for you after that. I feel like. If I could do a small cover on breaks and equipment, 300% stats are the highest you can go in terms of Neovision units. Huh. And in the future, this will be even more confusing for new players. You can go to 600% on Neovision Plus units. Not currently on Global, so don't worry just yet. But in the future, I would really recommend watching all my Neovision Plus videos. I made quite a few guides on that, so I'd recommend watching that. The morale bar. So, healing, MP recovery, those are smaller ones. And then there's abilities and passives that allow you to get some naturally. So the higher you go on this side, you want to go this way, depending on what you're looking on the screen. You want bar go up onto their side, so that you have more morale, so you're able to get more passives that unlock to abilities. Certain characters have abilities unlocked when they're able to get to a certain threshold. Certain abilities do more, and Brave Shift LBs, or LBs in general, do more damage depending on how much morale you have. And you're able to access some morale abilities. If you click on the numbers at the top, or stars, or whatever you click on, you'll have some abilities that you can unlock depending on how far you've gone. And some characters actually have abilities if the enemies has more morale than you do. Not very many these days, but there are some. There are some that have that. Alright, so why do critical hits do not do more damage in this game? Because most of them are just tied to normal abilities, like normal attacks, and those aren't very useful. I can probably count on like my hands how many people have critical hits. Not very useful. It was never explored in the game, because probably if you gave critical hits to an actual DPS, it would probably be okay decently. There was that one Yuna, the 5-star one, had critical hits on a chaining, and it didn't do anything. I believe it was the Yuna. The X2 Yuna, the 5-star version, had critical hits on a chaining or something. She had an ability of some kind that did chaining, and it did nothing. It was worthless. So critical hits in other games typically is a good thing, but in this game you're not looking for it. It's so obscure that I think that they forgot about it even existing. And the synergy between teams, I think we just talked about that a little bit, but we'll talk more about it. So you definitely want to have a magic tank, because unless you're fighting something you know is only doing physical, which is pretty rare nowadays, because most bosses do 3 types. Most bosses that are in Clash Duels, for example, do physical, magical, and fixed. So you want someone who can do, like Cecil, the new Cecil, the one that has a Brave Shift form and has the field effect that everybody loves. You kind of want to have him because he has an Omni Cover for 1 turn, which Omni Cover allows you to cover any kind of damage. It doesn't matter what it is, which is good. You want to have a physical or magic tank. That's the first. That's like the sandwich. That's like the bottom of the sandwich. Like, you can't make a sandwich without the bottom, so you need to have that. Next, you need to have a breaker, like I mentioned. Specifically, I had made a whole section just for breakers I talked about. You need someone who can break. If you don't have anyone who can break and they can be broken, you're not going to get very far. So whatever breaker you have is what you're gonna have to use. Next, support. Sylvia's probably the best example. Not the only example, but the easiest example you guys can follow along. Sylvia has everything you'd ever want. Even nowadays, she's still good. She has everything you would ever possibly need ever in this game. Unless you need different killers, but she has pretty much everything else you'd want. So now you have a cover tank, you have a breaker, you have a support. That support could also be healing, but healers aren't really necessary nowadays because most supports have healing already. Next, you want someone who can deal a lot of damage. Those are typically called finishers, and sometimes you can't get away with them, so in this slot you might have a healer instead. Because Because some fights you just can't get away with having a finisher because the boss may just deal too much damage. Even if you have good mitigation and good breaks, the boss just does incredible damage to you no matter what. So you need to have a healer or something of that role. So that fourth spot could be it's like a wild card for you. You can put a healer in, you can put another support in, you can have 2 supports, or a finisher, depending on what the fight is. And then 5 and 6 are going to be your chainers. 5 is definitely going to be your main chainer, and then 6 is usually the friend unit chainer, or in Clash Royale your other chainer. And those two need to work together. They need to have the same chaining frames, or at least work together in some regard. Probably the best example would be A2 and 2B, because they can chain together. That's just an easy example. So, or in normal trials, do 2Ps together because they can chain together just fine in multiple frames. So those are some questions I've answered, and now let's go into the next section. So here I posted this a day ago, so I was like, oh, if you didn't post that, go ahead and make sure you post. As power creep really impactful in this game? Yes. In terms of recent events, yes, but not like the King Mog or like the certificate events and raid events. Those are easily done with anything pretty much at this point. You can bring a friend in one shot to anything, but power creep is getting really bad. It really is. I can't lie about that. It's something I don't really want to talk about too much because I know people get bored of it, but it is something that is happening in this game progressively, and they've got basically once a game gets into this loop of power creep where the next banner has to be better than the last, they get stuck in a hole. If you weren't around, the beginning of Neovision was pretty tame. Every unit that came out was pretty good. It wasn't like, oh my god, this guy is way too good to be in the game, kind of a thing. Like, they were just good. They were not stuck in the hole yet. They were making good units, but not power creep. It was this unit's good, this unit's good. Oh, this unit's not as good, but that's okay. This unit's good, this unit's good. And it's good that every unit is good in a way, but not overstepping the other units. And then eventually they got themselves stuck in a hole because they couldn't stop themselves from making stronger units, so they eventually had to do that, and that's what we're in right now. So we're in definitely a power creep. Are Neovision units bad? Depends. There's a small handful of Neovision Awakenings that are still good or will be good when they come out. The best example currently is the Axstar. The Diva Axstar was really good, but there's not very many other examples, and there's not very many other Neovision Awakenings in the game. They're going to be coming. I think they haven't. I can't even remember the last Neovision Awakening that they've made on JP. So explaining about amps, you need to have amps. They're in the game now. Specifically, you need to have them. If the unit does not have amps, you need to give it to them via a support that has 100% amp, typically unlocked through a certain EX level. Amps just deal. You're allowed to deal. You're gonna do more damage depending on what element you have. So, for example, you need to do the element or be imbued by the element that you're being amped by. So, let's take a very simple example. You got Leftia. She has 100% amp. If you have that story thing equipped, I think, or maybe, I can't remember if it's story of an equipment, or I think it is. But you give someone 100% fire amp, but you don't have an element that you're imbued with ice, for example, but you amp them with fire. They're not going to deal any more damage than they would have without it because they're not dealing fire damage. So you need to have a fire element either locked to the unit or imbue the element to the unit and the amp, which will allow you to do more damage. Pretty simple. I think that's a pretty good explanation. I already talked about the formation of the units, so make sure you listen to that, which you should have already done if you got to this part. And why should I even start? Because you like Final Fantasy? I think that's all I'm gonna give for that question, because I don't know if the game's gonna shut down or not. No one does, other than people running the game. They know. So I'm just gonna give the simple example or answer of, if you like Final Fantasy, you should play the game, because there's still a lot of Final Fantasy characters coming out. As of this video, Noctis, Ramza, yeah, he's finally getting a CG. Alright, so that's going to be it for this beginner's video. I really don't know what I'm going to title this, but hopefully it'll catch on to anyone that's new. that wants to watch this video. Hopefully my explanations were good, because they're kind of off the cuff. It's just stuff that I've known for years in terms of this game. So if you have any more other questions, I'm going to make a part 2. But apologies if you weren't able to get your question in. I read all the ones that were posted. So make sure you look at my community tab every now and then. So I may post something like this where like, oh, what's like the hardest thing you guys can't understand or something like that. I might post more of those. Alright guys, I'll see you in the next video. Peace.